It was a typical morning in Maple Grove, a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Birds chirped in the trees, and the hum of the early commuters started to fade as the sun began to rise higher. For most of the residents, it was just another day to look forward to, the kind of peaceful morning that made the suburban life feel so perfect. But in the Thompson household, things were anything but peaceful. Max, their large and energetic dog, had already begun his daily routine, barking. It wasn't just a playful bark, it was loud, jarring, and persistent. The Thompson family had only moved into their new home a few weeks ago, and while they were still settling in, Max seemed to have already claimed his new territory. He barked at the wind, at passing cars, at anything that moved outside the window. His barks were a constant reminder that the Thompson household wasn't quite as peaceful as the others. At first, the neighbors had been understanding. They were, after all, a young family, and everyone knew the challenges of adjusting to a new home. But as the days went by, something started to change. The barking didn't stop. It grew louder, more frequent, and more irritating. Max was no longer just a dog in the background of suburban life, he was the soundtrack to the neighborhood, and not in a good way. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the noise had become unbearable for the Johnsons, who lived directly next door. Mrs. Johnson, a woman who prided herself on her garden and the peace of her afternoons, had already endured 2 hours of Max's barking. She was losing her patience. The sound of the dog's frantic barks was like a needle scratching against a chalkboard, sharp, grating, and relentless. With each passing minute, her frustration grew. She had tried everything, closing windows, turning on the television, even playing music to drown out the sound, but nothing worked. The dog's barking seeped through every crack in the walls, every corner of her home. She had to do something about it. No one, not even the new neighbors, could disrupt her peace like this. Her husband, Richard, was a patient man. He didn't like confrontation, but even he could hear the maddening barks from their living room. He turned to his wife. "Maybe we should just go over and talk to them," he suggested, knowing full well how much she hated conflict. Mrs. Johnson stood up from her chair, her face tight with the growing frustration. "I can't take it anymore, Richard," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "We've asked them nicely, but nothing has changed. I'm going over there. I'm not going to let this dog ruin our lives." And so, she walked to the front door, her steps firm and determined. With a deep breath, she opened it and stepped outside. The air was still and quiet, except for Max, whose barking seemed to echo down the street. As Mrs. Johnson made her way across the lawn, a knot formed in her stomach. She hated confrontation, but she knew this had gone too far. The peace she had enjoyed in this neighborhood was slipping away, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers without a fight. As she approached the Thompsons' front door, her heart raced in her chest. This wasn't going to be easy. She didn't know the Thompsons well, and she certainly didn't know how they would react. But the tension had already reached its breaking point. She had to say something. She had to make them understand. She rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the air, and for a moment, there was silence on the other side. Mrs. Johnson could feel her hands shaking as she waited. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The door creaked open, and there stood Mrs. Thompson, a kind smile on her face, until she saw the expression on Mrs. Johnson's. "Hi, Mrs. Johnson," she said warmly, her voice filled with politeness. "What's up?" "I need to talk to you about your dog," Mrs. Johnson said, her tone sharp, but trying to remain composed. "Max has been barking nonstop, and I'm afraid it's affecting everyone around here. I've tried to be patient, but this has gone on long enough." The smile on Mrs. Thompson's face faltered as she glanced behind her, where Max's barking could still be heard. She sighed. "I'm so sorry about that, Mrs. Johnson. He's still adjusting to the move. I promise we're doing everything we can to train him." But Mrs. Johnson was already at her breaking point. "It's been weeks. This is unbearable. We can't even enjoy a peaceful day in our own home. You have to do something about this." The tension in the air thickened. Mrs. Thompson looked as though she wanted to apologize, but the words felt stuck in her throat. She had tried everything, training Max, keeping him inside more, but nothing had worked. She wasn't sure what else she could do, but the frustration in Mrs. Johnson's voice made it clear that this situation was no longer something they could brush aside. "I understand, truly," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice softening. "We're trying, but we're new here. We don't want to upset anyone. I'm so sorry that it's been this bad." But Mrs. Johnson wasn't satisfied. She crossed her arms, her patience wearing thin. "You have to take responsibility for your dog. I don't care if you're new here. We've been living peacefully for years, and I'm not going to let a dog ruin it. Something has to change, and it has to change now." Mrs. Thompson stood there, caught off guard by the intensity of the confrontation. She hadn't expected things to get this far, but she also knew that this couldn't continue. The tension between the neighbors was already palpable, and the last thing she wanted was to escalate the situation. "I'll try again," Mrs. Thompson said quietly, "but please, give us some time." As Mrs. Johnson turned to leave, she couldn't help but feel that the issue wasn't just about a dog anymore, it was about respect. It was about the right to peace and quiet in her own home. She had stood by for too long, and now she had taken a stand. But as she walked back to her house, the heavy feeling of uncertainty settled in. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she'd have to confront the Thompsons. The issue wasn't just about Max. It was about boundaries, about the kind of neighborhood Maple Grove was becoming. And if something wasn't done soon, this small issue could turn into a much bigger problem. It was an unusually warm morning in Maple Grove, the kind of perfect day where the air was crisp and the sun bathed the suburban neighborhood in golden light. The trees were beginning to show the early signs of autumn, their leaves just beginning to turn shades of orange and yellow. The sounds of birds chirping, kids playing in their front yards, and the occasional car driving by filled the air, creating the comforting hum of suburban life. For most of the residents, it was just another quiet day in the perfect neighborhood, the kind they had dreamed of when they first moved here. It was supposed to be a peaceful, easygoing community where people waved to each other as they passed by, and the days seemed to stretch on without worry. But in the Thompson household, the day was anything but peaceful. Max, their large, boisterous dog, had a habit. It wasn't an ordinary habit, it was loud, persistent, and, to the neighbors, downright maddening. Max had arrived at the Thompson home just a few weeks ago, a young and energetic dog who was still getting used to his new surroundings. But instead of easing into his new life quietly, Max had decided to make a statement from the very first morning. He started barking. And he didn't stop. The first few days, the barking seemed tolerable. It was understandable, after all, Max was new to the neighborhood, and he was adjusting. But as the days turned into weeks, the barking didn't slow down. It grew louder, more frequent, and increasingly frustrating. Every morning at the crack of dawn, Max's barks rang through the neighborhood. They weren't just the playful barks of a dog enjoying his yard, they were loud, insistent, and never-ending. He barked at the passing cars, at the squirrels running along the fence, at the mailman, and at the slightest rustling of the leaves. The barking seemed to be constant, an unrelenting sound that pierced through the otherwise peaceful mornings. At first, the neighbors were patient. They understood that adjusting to a new environment could take time. But patience has its limits. Mrs. Johnson, who lived next door, was the first to feel the frustration building. She had been living in Maple Grove for over 15 years and had come to cherish the quiet. She was the type of person who enjoyed her garden, the morning quiet, and the soft chirping of the birds outside her window. She had earned her peace, and she didn't want it disrupted. But every morning, without fail, Max's barks shattered her peace, making it impossible for her to enjoy her morning coffee or tend to her flowers. After a week of trying to ignore it, she realized that the noise wasn't going away. It was getting worse. She tried closing her windows, hoping the barking would be quieter. She played soothing music in the background to drown out the sound. But Max was relentless. His barking echoed through her entire house, piercing every corner of her space. Her irritation began to grow, but she kept it to herself, believing it was just a matter of time before the Thompsons would take care of their dog. However, as the days wore on, her patience wore thin. Mrs. Johnson had lived in peace for too long to let a dog ruin her mornings. One particular Saturday, after enduring yet another morning of Max's barking, Mrs. Johnson couldn't take it anymore. She was fed up. She had asked politely a couple of times, but the barking hadn't stopped. It wasn't just a nuisance anymore, it was becoming unbearable. She had enough. With a sigh, Mrs. Johnson grabbed her jacket and walked across the street to the Thompson household. Her steps were heavy, each one filled with the frustration she had been holding in for far too long. She didn't want to cause trouble, she just wanted to be heard. She didn't know how the Thompsons would react, whether they'd be apologetic or defensive. But at that moment, she didn't care. She had reached her limit. The doorbell rang, and she stood there, waiting. The sound of Max's barking seemed to grow louder, almost mocking her as she waited on the doorstep. Finally, the door opened, and Mrs. Thompson appeared, a friendly smile on her face, until she saw the stern expression on Mrs. Johnson's face. Mrs. Johnson didn't waste any time. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson," she started, trying to keep her voice calm despite the growing irritation in her chest. "I need to talk to you about your dog." Mrs. Thompson's smile faltered as she glanced behind her at the still barking Max. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson. Is there a problem?" Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath, her voice steady but firm. "Yes, there is. Max's barking has gotten out of control. It's been going on for weeks now, and I can't even sit in my own backyard without being disturbed. It's loud, and it's constant. I've tried to be patient, but I'm afraid I can't tolerate it anymore." Mrs. Thompson's expression softened. She knew the barking was a problem, but she hadn't realized it was causing such frustration for their neighbors. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Johnson. We've been trying to train him, but it's been difficult. He's just getting used to the new house." "I understand that he's adjusting," Mrs. Johnson replied, "but it's not fair to the rest of us. I've lived here for 15 years, and I've never had an issue like this. We deserve some peace, too." Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Max, who was still barking nonstop. She could hear the frustration in Mrs. Johnson's voice, and she felt guilty. "I'll talk to Paul," she said quietly. "We'll do our best to keep Max inside more. I'm really sorry for the trouble." But Mrs. Johnson wasn't satisfied. She had heard the same empty promises before, and she knew that nothing would change unless she took a stand. "I don't think trying is enough anymore. You need to do something about it. It's not just about 1 or 2 barks a day. It's all day, every day." The word stung, but Mrs. Thompson nodded. She knew Mrs. Johnson was right. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a problem that needed a solution, and it needed to be fixed soon. As Mrs. Johnson turned and walked back to her house, she couldn't help but feel a sense of anger boiling inside. She had never been confrontational, but today, she had had enough. The calm, peaceful life she had once known in Maple Grove was slipping away, and she was determined not to let it disappear. She had made her point, but she knew this wouldn't be the last time she had to deal with it. The situation had only just begun, and Mrs. Johnson had a feeling that things were going to get even more complicated before they got better. Would the Thompsons fix the problem, or would this conflict continue to escalate? Only time would tell. The next few days in Maple Grove felt different. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, the laughter of children playing, the hum of lawnmowers, and the occasional car driving by, seemed to be muffled by the underlying tension. The quiet had been shattered by Max's incessant barking, and now the unspoken discomfort lingered like a thick fog. Mrs. Johnson had made her stand, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the issue wasn't just about a dog, it was about respect. It was about the peace that she had fought so hard to protect in her home. Paul and Linda, the Thompsons, had not expected the confrontation with Mrs. Johnson to escalate the way it had. They had tried to be good neighbors, and they had never intended to disrupt the harmony of Maple Grove. But Max's behavior, which they thought was just a phase, had become an undeniable problem. The barking seemed endless, and despite their best efforts, they had been unable to stop it. But they were now facing the reality of the situation, a situation that would test their patience, their understanding of their neighbors, and their sense of responsibility. Late one afternoon, after work, Paul sat down with Linda in their living room, staring at the wall where Max's leash hung. Max was curled up on the floor, his occasional whimper the only sound breaking the silence. Paul sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead in frustration. "I don't know what else to do, Linda," Paul admitted, his voice tinged with defeat. "We've tried everything. Training, the collar, keeping him inside. It's not working." Linda, who had been quieter than usual, sat across from him, her arms crossed. She wasn't angry, but she was deeply unsettled by the tension that had erupted between them and their neighbors. She had never wanted this to happen. "I know. I feel terrible. We didn't think it would escalate like this. We just wanted to fit in, to be part of the community. I thought it would be fine." She paused, taking a deep breath, and then continued, "But now I can't stop thinking about Mrs. Johnson. She's right, Paul. We've been here for weeks, and it's like we haven't even considered how our dog's behavior affects anyone else." Paul let out a frustrated breath and ran his hand through his hair. "I know. But it's hard. Max is part of the family. It's hard to accept that we might have to give up on him, or worse, move because of his behavior." "Paul, we're not giving up on him," Linda replied quickly. "But we need to fix this. We need to at least show Mrs. Johnson that we're taking responsibility. Maybe we need to apologize properly, ask for her patience, and try something else. Maybe a professional trainer?" Her voice wavered slightly as she suggested the idea, but there was resolve behind it. They had to do something before things got worse. As Paul nodded, agreeing with Linda's suggestion, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They had been so caught up in the excitement of their new home, in the hope of starting fresh in a place that felt like a dream, that they hadn't fully thought through the impact their new pet would have on the neighborhood. The problem wasn't just about the noise. It was about being newcomers who hadn't fully grasped the rhythm of a neighborhood that had lived peacefully for years. Mrs. Johnson wasn't just complaining about a dog, she was defending the peace of the home she had worked hard to create. For her, it wasn't a simple nuisance, it was a violation of the tranquility that made Maple Grove so special. The more Paul and Linda thought about it, the more they realized how out of place they felt now. The neighborhood wasn't hostile, but it was tense, and the rift between them and their neighbors was growing. Paul and Linda both agreed that they couldn't wait any longer to address the issue. They needed to make things right with Mrs. Johnson. So, they decided to visit her and apologize once again, but this time, they would do more than just offer empty promises. They would show her they were taking action. Linda made a mental note to call a professional dog trainer the next morning, and Paul vowed to spend more time with Max, keeping him indoors during the critical hours when the barking seemed to be at its worst. That evening, Paul and Linda walked across the street, their steps slow and heavy. As they reached Mrs. Johnson's front door, Paul knocked firmly, but not too forcefully, a polite gesture that matched the tension he felt inside. The door opened almost immediately, and Mrs. Johnson appeared, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Johnson," Linda began, her voice sincere but cautious. "We've been thinking about our conversation the other day, and we realized that we've failed to take the full responsibility for the noise Max is causing. We're sorry for not acting sooner." Paul stepped forward, adding, "We've already scheduled a training session with a professional, and we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. We want to make this right, and we'd appreciate your patience while we get this under control." Mrs. Johnson's face softened slightly, but the wariness was still there. "I appreciate that," she said, crossing her arms. "But I'll be honest with you, if things don't change, I won't be the only one complaining. Max's barking is affecting everyone around here, not just me. I'm glad you're taking responsibility, but you need to understand that this can't keep going on." Paul nodded, his face etched with guilt. "We understand, and we'll make it right. We've learned our lesson, Mrs. Johnson." Linda gave a small smile, one that was both relieved and apologetic. We just ask for your understanding as we work through this. We don't want to cause any more trouble." The conversation ended on a tentative note of agreement. Mrs. Johnson gave them a brief nod and shut the door, leaving Paul and Linda standing on the porch, staring at each other. They knew that while things hadn't been fixed entirely, they had taken the first step toward resolution. They still had a long way to go to regain the trust of their neighbors, but at least they had started down the path of making things right. The days following their conversation with Mrs. Johnson felt tense for the Thompsons. Paul and Linda had made a promise to resolve the issue, but despite their best efforts, the barking continued. Max, though a loving and energetic dog, had developed a pattern that was proving difficult to break. The training sessions with the professional dog trainer had begun, but progress was slow. Max's barking didn't just happen in the morning anymore, it had spread to midday, and sometimes even in the late afternoon. The sound of his barks was like a hammer on the tranquility of the neighborhood, and no matter what Paul and Linda tried, it seemed like the noise would not stop. The atmosphere in Maple Grove had shifted. What once felt like a peaceful, tight-knit community now felt strained. Neighbors who had once waved at each other from across their lawns were now avoiding eye contact. The small, casual exchanges that had made the neighborhood feel welcoming were replaced by polite but distant nods. The invisible barrier between the Thompsons and the rest of the neighborhood was growing thicker every day, and they could feel it. The weight of the situation was heavy on both of them. One evening, after another unsuccessful training session with Max, Paul and Linda sat down at the kitchen table, exhausted. The house was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves outside. Max, curled up in his bed, was finally resting, but it was clear that his barking had taken a toll on both him and the Thompsons. "I don't know what we're doing wrong," Linda said, her voice tinged with frustration. "We're doing everything we can to make this right, but it feels like it's not enough. The neighbors are still upset, and I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Paul ran his hand through his hair, the exhaustion settling deep in his bones. "I don't know either. I thought things would get better once we tried the training. But Max is barking, it's just not stopping. I can hear it in Mrs. Johnson's voice. She's done being patient." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their failure hanging over them. It wasn't just the dog's barking that was causing the tension, it was the fact that they had come to realize how little they understood about the community they had moved into. Maple Grove had its own rhythm, its own set of expectations, and in trying to fit in, they had inadvertently disrupted that rhythm. The truth was, they hadn't just been neglecting Max's training, they had been neglecting the very essence of what had made their neighborhood so special in the first place, its sense of community, its mutual respect for everyone's space. "I think it's time we talk to Mrs. Johnson again," Paul said, breaking the silence. "We need to do more than apologize. We need to show her we're doing everything we can. We can't let this ruin our lives here, Linda." Linda nodded. "You're right. We've already let this go on too long. It's not just about the barking anymore, it's about earning back the trust of the people who live here. We need to make things right, once and for all." The next day, they walked over to Mrs. Johnson's house, determined to fix what had been broken. When they arrived at the front door, Mrs. Johnson answered quickly, her expression guarded but not unfriendly. "We've been thinking a lot about the situation," Paul began, his voice calm and measured. "And we're committed to doing whatever it takes to make this right. We've scheduled more training for Max. We're bringing in a second trainer who specializes in this kind of behavior. And we're going to keep him indoors more, especially during the hours when the barking seems to be the worst." Mrs. Johnson listened quietly, her arms crossed. She didn't say anything for a few moments, but the silence wasn't as tense as it had been during their last conversation. She seemed to be considering their words. "I appreciate the effort," she said, her voice a little softer. "But it's not just about Max. It's about all of us here. We've been living in this neighborhood for a long time, and the peace of this place means everything to us. It's been tough. I've had neighbors in the past who've been inconsiderate, and it takes a lot for me to speak up like this. But the truth is, Max's barking has been affecting everyone. It's not just me." Paul looked down, guilt flooding his chest. We understand. And I think we've finally realized what we've been doing wrong. We didn't take the time to understand how important this community is. We didn't understand what Maple Grove means to the people who have lived here for so long. Linda added, we've learned a lot in the last few weeks. We don't just want to be neighbors. We want to be part of this community, and we know we need to do more than just apologize. We need to show you that we can be trusted. Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. I can see you're trying, and I can respect that. I know you didn't mean to cause trouble, but you have to understand, it's not just about the dog. It's about how we all coexist here. It's about our ability to live in peace. You've made an effort, and I can see that you care. I'll give you time to fix this, but please understand, we can't let this go on much longer. The conversation left Paul and Linda feeling conflicted. They had made progress, but the truth was, the damage had been done. Mrs. Johnson's words echoed in their minds. It wasn't just the dog. It was about the neighborhood, the trust, and the peace they had taken for granted. That night, after dinner, they sat quietly in the living room, the weight of everything they had heard sinking in. They had always wanted to fit in. They had always wanted to be good neighbors, but they had underestimated the importance of understanding the dynamics of a community. It wasn't just about solving problems, it was about being part of something bigger. And now, as they sat in silence, they realized that the real challenge wasn't just training Max. It was learning how to be part of something that had already been built, a community that valued its peace above all else. The issue with Max was not just about training him to stop barking. It was about showing Mrs. Johnson and the rest of the neighborhood that they understood what it meant to be part of Maple Grove. It was about restoring the sense of peace they had unknowingly disrupted. The following week felt like the longest week of Paul and Linda's lives. The pressure to fix things between them and their neighbors, especially Mrs. Johnson, was starting to feel like an insurmountable weight. Max's barking hadn't stopped entirely, despite the additional training sessions, and the second trainer's advice seemed to take longer to show results than they had hoped. At times, it felt like no matter what they did, things only seemed to get worse. On one particularly tense afternoon, after yet another day filled with barking and failed attempts at calming Max, Linda found herself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window. Her thoughts were heavy, clouded by the growing divide between them and the neighborhood. What had started as a simple desire to live in peace had quickly turned into a battle for their place in this tight-knit community. They didn't want to be the outsiders, but with every bark that echoed from Max, it felt like they were getting farther and farther from being accepted. I'm scared, Paul, Linda said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared we've already lost them. I can see it in Mrs. Johnson's eyes. She's done. Paul, who had been sitting on the couch, rubbed his face tiredly. The weight of the situation was finally starting to break him down, too. He had never imagined that moving into a new home would come with this much stress. The neighborhood that had once seemed so perfect now felt suffocating, and they were caught in a cycle of failure. I don't want to lose this, Linda, Paul replied, his voice filled with frustration. I don't want to give up on Max, and I don't want to give up on this community. But every time I try, it feels like the gap between us and the others gets wider. Max, who had been curled up in his bed, suddenly perked up and started to bark again. It was his usual greeting, the one that had become far too familiar to everyone in the neighborhood. Linda turned to Paul, her face hardening. This is it, Paul, she said, her tone sharp and resolute. We need to go over there and fix this once and for all. I can't take it anymore. We can't just keep apologizing and hoping things get better. We need to show them that we care, that we're committed to being part of this community. If we don't act now, we're going to lose everything. Paul hesitated for a moment, looking at Linda, then at Max, who was still barking away. He knew she was right. The situation couldn't go on any longer. It wasn't just about Max anymore, it was about proving to the neighborhood that they belonged, that they were willing to do what it took to make things right. The longer they waited, the more distant the possibility of reconciliation seemed. He stood up, his decision made. You're right, he said, a sense of determination finally breaking through the frustration. Let's do this. We can't keep running from it. It's time to face it head on. Without wasting another minute, Paul and Linda walked across the street to Mrs. Johnson's house. As they approached her front door, they could feel the weight of the moment. The nervousness, the uncertainty, they had been here before, but this time it was different. They weren't just asking for forgiveness, they were asking for a chance to rebuild the trust that had been lost. When Mrs. Johnson opened the door, she greeted them with the same reserved expression as before. There was no warm smile, no casual conversation, just a silent acknowledgement of their presence. "We need to talk, Mrs. Johnson," Paul said, his voice steady. "We've been thinking a lot about everything, and we know we've failed to do enough. We didn't realize the impact Max's barking was having on you and the rest of the neighborhood. We've been trying everything we can, but it's clear that we need to do more." Mrs. Johnson didn't say anything at first, just stood there, arms crossed. Her eyes were still guarded, but there was a small flicker of something, perhaps hope, that told Paul and Linda they hadn't completely lost her. "I know it's not just about the barking, Mrs. Johnson," Linda continued, her voice soft but firm. "It's about the community, the peace that everyone here values. We're not just asking for your patience anymore, we're asking for your understanding. We want to fix this, not just for us, but for the whole neighborhood. We're committed to Max's training, and we'll do whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen again." There was a long pause. Mrs. Johnson's face remained unreadable, but she took a deep breath before speaking. "You know," she said slowly, "I didn't want things to get to this point. I've lived here for a long time, and I've always valued the quiet. This neighborhood is like a family, and I've spent years making sure that peace is maintained. But I also understand that we all make mistakes. What matters now is how we fix it." Linda and Paul exchanged a glance, both feeling the weight of Mrs. Johnson's words. They had come here expecting another confrontation, but what they got instead was a glimmer of hope. "We've heard your concerns," Paul said, his voice more sincere than ever. "And we're willing to do whatever it takes. We want to prove that we can be a part of this community, that we can respect the peace you all have worked so hard to maintain. We just need the chance." Mrs. Johnson looked at them for a long moment, her arms still crossed, but her expression softening. Finally, she nodded. "I'll give you a chance," she said, her voice quieter now. "But it's not just about you two anymore. It's about all of us. You need to work with the rest of the neighborhood, and we need to make sure that Max's barking doesn't disturb anyone else. This can't happen again. But if you're willing to make that commitment, I think we can move forward." Paul and Linda breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had done it. They had taken responsibility, and now they had been given a chance to prove that they could be good neighbors. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson," Linda said, her voice filled with gratitude. "We won't let you down." As they walked back to their house, there was a renewed sense of purpose in their steps. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would still be challenges ahead, but they knew they had made the right choice. They had taken the first real step toward rebuilding their relationship with the neighborhood, and that was something they could be proud of. For the first time in weeks, the air felt a little lighter, and the future, though uncertain, seemed full of possibility. The days that followed the tense conversation with Mrs. Johnson felt like a breath of fresh air for Paul and Linda. While the problem with Max wasn't completely solved, there was a shift in the air, an understanding between them and the neighborhood that hadn't been there before. The weight of the confrontation was gone, replaced by a sense of hope that things might finally begin to change. Paul and Linda immediately took action. They called in a second dog trainer, someone with experience in handling dogs with persistent barking issues. This time, they were determined to follow through on everything, not just for their sake, but for the sake of the entire community. They committed to Max's behavior with a level of seriousness they hadn't before. They began keeping Max inside during certain hours and worked tirelessly to reduce his barking, even when it felt like they weren't making progress. Every small victory, whether it was a quiet afternoon or a successful training session, was a reminder that they were on the right path. But even with their efforts, things were still far from perfect. The tension that had once hung over the neighborhood lingered, though it had softened. People were still wary, and Paul and Linda knew they couldn't expect things to change overnight. The damage had been done, and trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. They knew that actions spoke louder than words, and they had to prove their commitment to their neighbors, especially to Mrs. Johnson. As they continued working with Max and keeping their promises to the neighborhood, Paul and Linda realized that the issue wasn't just about controlling the noise. It was about restoring their place in Maple Grove, about showing that they truly cared for the community they had joined. They began making more of an effort to engage with their neighbors, not just to smooth things over but to truly connect. They attended neighborhood events, hosted small get-togethers, and reached out to neighbors who had been distant in the aftermath of the barking debacle. One evening, a couple of weeks after the confrontation with Mrs. Johnson, they were invited over to the Johnsons for a small dinner. It wasn't an official gesture of reconciliation, but it was a start. Mrs. Johnson had reached out, and that, for Paul and Linda, was a sign that the rift was beginning to heal. As they sat at the dinner table, enjoying a homemade meal and chatting about everyday life, it felt as though a weight had been lifted. The conversations flowed more easily, and the awkwardness that had once existed between them had faded. It wasn't an immediate fix, but it was a sign of progress, an indication that things were moving in the right direction. "Max's barking has really calmed down," Mrs. Johnson remarked at one point, smiling across the table. "I've been hearing a lot less of it, which is a relief. And I can see how much you both care about making things right." Paul and Linda exchanged a look, both feeling a sense of pride that they hadn't felt in weeks. "We're doing everything we can," Linda replied. "But we're also grateful for your understanding. We know we've made mistakes, and we just want to make sure this neighborhood feels like home again, for everyone." "I can tell you're trying," Mrs. Johnson said with a small, approving smile. "And I appreciate that. It's not easy to admit when you've made a mistake, but you've done it, and that means something." The dinner ended on a warm note, and as they left the Johnsons' home, Paul and Linda felt a renewed sense of optimism. The hard work was far from over, but they had made real progress. The apology was accepted, the trust was being slowly rebuilt, and most importantly, the community was beginning to feel whole again. Over the next few months, the Thompsons continued to prove themselves to the neighborhood. Max's barking became less of an issue, and they spent more time fostering connections with their neighbors. The neighborhood, once divided, slowly started to return to its former state of unity. The block party, which had been a source of tension in the past, became an event where the Thompsons were warmly welcomed, no longer outsiders but part of the fabric of Maple Grove. The lesson they had learned was simple but profound: community wasn't just about living next to each other. It was about understanding, respecting, and supporting one another, especially when things got tough. The road to rebuilding trust had been long and challenging, but it was worth it. The Thompsons had learned that no matter how hard it may seem, the effort to make things right, through action, empathy, and patience, could heal even the most strained relationships. The final thought. As the sun set over Maple Grove, the Thompsons stood in their front yard, looking out over the neighborhood. The last few months had been a whirlwind of frustration, growth, and learning, but now, as they watched children playing in the street and neighbors chatting on their porches, they felt a deep sense of peace. The neighborhood had been restored, not just through their efforts, but through the understanding and cooperation of everyone involved. In the end, the challenge of Max's barking had brought them closer to the people they lived next to. It had shown them the importance of community, of never taking the peace for granted, and of always being willing to do the hard work required to make things right. And as for Max, he was now a quieter, more content dog, and the Thompsons finally felt at home in Maple Grove. Their community was stronger than ever, and the bond that had been strained had been mended, slowly, carefully, but with a sense of permanence that could not be easily broken again. Lesson: the road to reconciliation can be difficult and uncomfortable, but through honesty, understanding, and genuine effort, even the most challenging conflicts can lead to stronger, more meaningful connections. Whether it's a dog's incessant barking or any other issue, the key is never giving up on the relationships that truly matter.